It was suggested that I talk in part about a recent report of the National Academy of Sciences that was commissioned by the U.S. Senate. This is a report on the widening gap in life expectancy, the widening gap by socioeconomic status, richer people living longer than poorer people, and how this affects government programs and how it affects the lifetime benefits that people receive. So I'm going to begin by talking about that report, maybe for the first half of my time, and then I'm going to talk about Latin America and some points that are related to this report. I'll talk about mortality differences by socioeconomic status in Latin America, try to talk about the public transfer system, the public sector benefits, and how they vary by social class, and some other things. So, let me get started here. Okay, this is the report, and it can be downloaded for free, the PDF from National Academies Press. It was released last September, and these are the people involved. Peter Orszag and I were co-chairs, and there were many distinguished economists on that panel. So, I was surprised and rather skeptical when I've read the literature that suggests that there are big differences in life expectancy by socioeconomic status in the United States, and even more surprised when the literature said that those differences were getting wider in recent decades. And I didn't believe the literature, partly because much of it looks at mortality in relation to education. And the problem with that is that when you look at changes over time, the share of the population that, say, has less than 8th grade education or less than high school education is getting smaller and smaller. And it's getting more and more highly selected for all sorts of characteristics that we don't observe but that would lead to poor health and death. So it's very difficult to make these comparisons and say, oh, this is getting worse or whatever. But some of these studies are finding differences by educational level of 10 to 15 years. Then another approach came along due to Hillary Waldron at the Social Security Administration. And this chart, this graph in particular, has had a big impact on lots of people, including me. What we see here, this is for Social Security data and Medicare, the healthcare system for elderly people, data on mortality. Here we have life expectancy at age 65. This is for cohorts or generations. So this is the generation born in 1912. This is the generation born in 1941, my generation. And what we see here is on top, life expectancy at age 65 for the top half of the earnings distribution. And here we see it for the bottom half of the earnings distribution. And you see remarkably that it's for the bottom half of the earnings distribution has hardly had any gain at all in life expectancy, or life expectancy at 65, over these 30 years of cohorts, whereas the top half of the earnings distribution has gained over 5 years. So the gap ends up increasing by 4.5 years across these generations. So that's the Waldron study, and it was, there were papers by Barry Bosworth and Burke there's been now a series of 3 or 4 papers that use Waldron's methodology, but use the Health and Retirement Survey to get socioeconomic data. The Health and Retirement Survey is linked to Social Security earnings histories. And so we and Bosworth in his papers pretty much follow what Waldron did. So we use health and retirement surveys from 1992 to 2008. Definition of socioeconomic status. I mentioned that many studies use education, and there are many good things about using education. There is that problem when you try to look at changes over time. Another approach is this mid-career earnings measure, where we use the Social Security earnings history and look at average earnings from age 41 to 50 for each individual. So you have an average over 10 years. It sort of evens out the ups and downs. And then we're looking at that in relation to mortality after age 50. So there isn't much of a problem, or there's a smaller problem of reverse causality. But as with the paper yesterday from Mathis, the issues of causality really don't arise here. All that matters is the association. Okay, and then we make an adjustment for couples. We add their earnings and divide by the square root of 2, which is an approximation to deal with economies of scale in the household. And that's the setup. And then we look at the mortality of cohorts born between 1912 and 1957 during this period, and then we extrapolate and interpolate beyond that period. So that's the setup, and this is what we find. So we focus on 2 birth cohorts, 2 generations, one born in 1930 and one born in 1960. So a generation born in 1960 is turning 50 years old in 2010, and that's sort of the beginning of the ages that we're analyzing, and it seems about the right generation if we're interested in future policy and so on. So we contrast mortality for these 2 generations. And the blue bars show differences in life expectancy at age 50. This is life expectancy at age 50 by quintile, income quintile, using this average mid-career earnings. So this is the lowest income, this is the highest income, and you can see that there is a gradient here. This is for men. The higher income men in the blue bars live 5 years longer after age 50 than the lowest quintile. For the 1960 cohort, in orange, we see that this increase, this gap, is much bigger. Now it's grown from 5 years to almost 13 years over that 30-year period. And for women, it's very similar. The gap grows from 4 years here to almost 14 years. And you can see that for the bottom income quintile and for the second income quintile, life expectancy at age 50 actually dropped over that 30-year period. And then it increased a great deal at higher quintiles. So this is very striking. And then I began to believe these results when I saw this and Waldron's study and Bosworth and Burke and so on. Okay. The next point is that these widening longevity differences interact with the public programs and, for example, with Social Security. So if you're a poor person, you have whatever your benefits are each year, but you also get them for a smaller number of years. And if you're a rich person, you get your benefits for a longer number of years. How much difference does this make? And how much change is there due to this widening of the socioeconomic differences over time? So, to examine this, we do a simulation experiment, you might say a thought experiment, and we assume we're looking at the initial population of the HRS sample with all their earnings, histories, and everything, and we calculate their lifetime benefits under two different mortality regime assumptions. One, the 1930 birth cohort mortality, the other, the 1960 birth cohort mortality, and the socioeconomic differences. Everything else is held the same. So it's sort of an experiment in which we vary only the mortality, or actually the health and the mortality, to see what the effect is on lifetime earnings. Okay. And we're applying the policy rules for taxes and benefits as they were in 2010. And what we're going to look at then is the present value of benefits received and taxes paid above age 50. And just before we start on that, I wanted to show you the progressivity that's built into the benefits for the Social Security system. There was some discussion of this yesterday, but the replacement rate is 90% for the first $800 earned in a month. Then it drops to 32%, just under a third, all the way up to about $5,000 monthly income. And then after that, it's only 15% for monthly earnings above $5,000. So it's designed to be very highly progressive. It's quite a different approach than most European systems and most other pension systems I know of. A bit surprising that it's the United States and we're farther out in this direction. Okay, so here is what we find. We'll look at a number of graphs, but basically this is much like those graphs for mortality. Here, you can't read anything here, but maybe you see the height of the charts. This is the 1930 mortality conditions. This is the 1960 mortality conditions. And here we're looking at the present value of lifetime Social Security benefits discounted at 2.9%. This is the discount rate Social Security uses. It's the rate that they are paid on their government bonds that they buy with their current surplus. Yeah. This is a good question. I think it's a real rate. I think it's a real rate because they separately make, yes, I'm quite sure it's a real rate. Okay, so you can see that the present value of lifetime benefits is higher for the top quintile than the bottom quintile. That's true under both mortality regimes. The gap, though, if you look at the difference between the quintile, top quintile and the bottom quintile, the gap in 1930 was $103,000. The gap in 1960, just due to the differences in mortality, grows to $173,000. In other words, just the widening of the mortality differential has added $70,000 to the difference in the present value of benefits. It's hard to talk about progressivity in either year because progressivity has to do with the benefits in relation to the contributions or the payroll taxes, and we don't have data on the lifetime payroll taxes. But what we can say is that whatever the progressivity would have been with the 1930 cohort, it's now much less. It's less by the $70,000. And for women, that change is $48,000. So that's Social Security. We do something similar for Medicare. That's health care for the elderly. You see that under the 1930 health and mortality conditions, there's very little difference across socioeconomic classes. That's because poor people are sicker, more disabled, and use the healthcare system more. So even though they don't live as long to use the benefits, they use them more intensively, and that sort of nets out. But when we look at the 1960 mortality regime, the difference has gone up by $53,000, and for women who use the healthcare system more, it's gone up by $70,000. So those are the big ones. And I think maybe I'll skip over these other programs. This is Medicaid, which pays for long-term care. It's very highly, you can see there's an asset test that's really for poor people to pay for long-term care, and it's used much more intensively by the bottom quintile in both simulations. There's very little change in progressivity due to mortality. This is total benefits. So the sum of those three programs I just looked at, plus I think disability, supplemental security income, which is like a safety net for people who don't qualify or have very low Social Security benefits. Well, here we have it, and also survivors insurance. So what happened? Here we go. So the increase for all these programs put together is $130,000 in gap for men and $160,000 for women. These are large amounts. One metric for saying how large they are is to compare them to an inclusive measure of wealth for these people at age 50. And by an inclusive measure, before I go to that, so this is present value of taxes, but only above age 50, so we can't really do the full analysis we'd like. But as you can see, it makes almost no difference to the present value of lifetime taxes evaluated at age 50 for various reasons. Virtually the whole effect is on the benefit side. Now, inclusive wealth. That includes assets, financial assets, stocks, bonds. It also includes home equity, that is ownership share of a home. It includes the present value of future earnings, survival weighted, and present value of future government benefits. And it includes minus the present value of expected taxes to be paid in the future. So that is the inclusive measure of wealth, and then we can express those changes relative to that measure of wealth. And when we do that, what we find is that, again, you won't be able to read these numbers, unfortunately, but there is an increase by, let's see, the top quintile has an increase of about 7%, the bottom quintile about 0% for the increase in lifetime benefits relative to this measure of wealth. For women, it's a bigger increase, 9% increase for the top quintile relative to the bottom quintile. So these are substantial relative to lifetime wealth. These are big changes that result from the mortality. The third thing I want to talk about now in this project is to look at some policy adjustments that are suggested as ways of addressing fiscal problems and for other reasons, for technical reasons. So we look at 6 commonly discussed policy adjustments, and the first of these is the early retirement age, raising the early retirement age. I'm sure you're all familiar with that concept, but it hasn't changed in the U.S. for quite a long time, and there at the same time that the normal retirement age is rising by 2 years under legislation that was passed back in the early 1980s, the early retirement age stays the same. Well, this was all discussed in the talk by Mathis yesterday. So a proposal would be to raise the early retirement age from 60 to 64. Well, this has an interesting effect. Because people are not currently retiring at an age which would maximize the present value of their benefits, they're retiring earlier on average. If you compel people to retire later, you actually raise the present value of their lifetime benefits. Because the higher income people are going to experience the higher benefits they get due to retiring later over more years, they benefit more than lower income people. And so this is has slightly regressive outcome for both men and for women. It's not a big deal. It's just slightly in that direction, and it's for a slightly surprising reason, as I just explained. And normal retirement age, this is also has some surprising twists. If you raise the normal retirement age, of course, it's like a benefit cut in some sense. It means that for any retirement at any age up till 70, you're going to be getting a lower benefit than otherwise. So this reduces the present value of future Social Security benefits by $30,000 for the bottom quintile, which is 25% of their total lifetime expected benefits from Social Security. Reduces it by a quarter. This is raising, I should say, the normal retirement age would be 67 for this generation. It's been slowly rising, and this would be a 3-year increase. So that cuts the lifetime benefits by a quarter for the bottom quintile, and it cuts it by 20% for the top quintile. So in that sense, it is making the system less progressive. And another metric is that the gap between the top and the bottom quintiles in lifetime benefits rises from 142% of the bottom quintile benefits to 157%. So it rises by 15%. Similarly, for females, the benefit falls by 18% for the bottom quintile and only 15% for the top quintile, and the gap grows in percentage terms. However, we'll come back to the progressivity issue. If you look at it a different way, the progressivity actually improves as a result of this rise in the normal retirement age, and it's counterintuitive. We'll come back to that. Now, another proposal is to raise the cost of living adjustment, and this would be related to the talk we had yesterday on what the appropriate indexation of benefits would be. This is really proposed for technical reasons in the U.S. It's suggested that the CPI doesn't represent well the cost of living for the elderly or for anyone, I guess. And the change CPI, which increases slightly less rapidly, would be a better measure. So it's about 0.2% per year lower on average. And in this case, it hits the top quintile harder because it compounds over the years. So the longer you live, the bigger the effect it has on your benefits in the end. It's a relatively small effect, but it is going in the direction of making the system more progressive. This was a surprise to me because I had imagined that the people that would be hitting hard are the elderly widows who've been retired a long time and so on. But it turns out, because of these socioeconomic class differences in mortality, it's really the rich who are hit hardest. Okay, I think I'll skip over some of these other things we looked at. You can find them in the report if you want. Now, we also assessed progressivity relative to wealth. using that inclusive measure of wealth. And the only thing I want to point out here is the counterintuitive effect here of raising the normal retirement age. This is this entry, and it turns out that by this measure of progressivity, it hits, relative to this wealth measure, it hits the top income quintile harder than it hits the bottom quintile. And the reason is that, let me see if I can get this straight. I think, no, I'm not going to be able to explain that exactly. It has to do with the share of the lifetime Social Security benefits in the total package of benefits that elderly high quintile versus low quintile receive. So this measure goes in the opposite direction, and that's attracted some attention, but the reader can take whichever measure they think is most relevant. Okay, so to conclude this piece, the top half of the income distribution has benefited much more from rising life expectancy than the bottom half. And we can look at it by quintiles or deciles, as is done in these studies. These widening survival differences mean that lifetime public benefits of high earners rise proportionately more than for low earners. And the widening survival differences also interact with potential policy changes that are intended to improve sustainability. And we weren't permitted to make any policy recommendations, so this is all rather bland, but we say these points should be considered when designing policy and policy changes, particularly in response to population aging. So that's the first part of my talk. And if you have a question or two or any comments, I'd be happy to take those now, and otherwise I'll move on. Yeah.
Basically, I mean, I know you were entitled to give any policy recommendations, but would this point to the fact that you have to adjust benefits according to income more if you want to somehow compensate for this, or you know, have different retirement ages for people of different incomes? Is that the way with this?
I think so, yes. So some of those policy experiments I didn't go over are things like changing that progressivity formula that I showed you earlier on. You can move the bend points. You can say that above a certain level, you get no increase in benefits. And it takes fairly strong changes in that benefit formula to offset the size of these impacts. But I think that's exactly the direction one would go. Now, since the progressivity should be relative to tax payments, and that really wasn't part of the analysis, I should say another frequently suggested policy change is to remove the earnings are taxed only up to a cap. The cap is now maybe $120,000 a year income. After that, the tax is zero. So it's often suggested that cap on taxable earnings should be removed and that all labor income should be taxed. And that, of course, would be hitting mostly the top, say, 2 quintiles, something like that. And that would also then increase the progressivity of the system by increasing what top higher income people paid in relative to the benefits. Well, you can do that and then leave those people with the same benefits in which you get a big effect, or you can have them get higher benefits as a result of higher taxes. There are different ways of doing it. Both help in terms of the fiscal side, but if you keep their benefits the same but remove the cap on taxes, you get the biggest effect, of course.
It may be that two things are equivalent. What I'm thinking of is if you come from a lower income background, you've got a shorter life expectancy, if annuity was priced perfectly, you'd get a better deal.
Yes, you would.
Longer life expectancy. Now, the progressive formula is reaching towards that, but I'm just asking myself without an answer, is there some way of trying to do that more directly?
Yeah.
And saying that if your lifetime income measured in some sensible way is lower, then you get explicitly and deliberately more bang for your contribution.
Okay. Now you're sort of jogging my memory, and we did think about trying to formulate some such things, but we weren't supposed to make recommendations. But it's difficult, and you right off then come up against the gender differences in life expectancy and but there's an appeal to trying to address it directly. Difficult. And this is also, I should say, I didn't mention this, it's confused by the fact that the differences by race in life expectancy have been shrinking. At the same time, the differences by income rising. Well, that doesn't really bear on your point, but yeah, it's an interesting suggestion.
Just following up on that, it seems that the American benefit formula simply does not show explicitly the mortality rules that are assumed. Those are fed into the level of the benefits. But what if mortality tables were incorporated explicitly into the benefit formula? That could allow a distinction by socioeconomic group.
Yes. So I guess what you could do is something, you would have the earnings history data. You could use that. You could do a calculation based on the average monthly payment of the average monthly earnings or something like that. That's an interesting idea. Now, there's a problem now, and the reason this 10-year window is used for the average rather than the lifetime is that the system is not yet fully matured. There are many people who didn't enter the system until they were in their 40s or 50s, doctors and so on. And so you don't have the earnings histories all the way back, and you have to do some sort of compromise. That would be less necessary moving forward to try to do something like what you've suggested. But, as I say, you would have to then, you'd have to make a decision about how you were going to handle gender, and I guess there could be different views on that. Okay, I will now move ahead, and I, of course, am not an expert on Latin America. I have some things to bring from the international project, national transfer accounts. I hope you will correct me if I say anything truly stupid. Okay. So I think of there being two global transitions over the last century or two. Speaking as a demographer, one of these transitions is the so-called demographic transition, as populations move from high fertility and high mortality to low fertility and low mortality, and then population aging is a part of this process, and the so-called demographic dividend in the middle of the transition is another part of this process. The other transition I call a transfer transition. It is a movement away from family support systems for the elderly or self-support through continuing to work and so on, towards public transfer systems. And part of that also is the movement towards public support for investment in human capital of kids, education, and health. So these two things are happening at the same time, and the interaction of the timing leads to different kinds of problems with fiscal sustainability and so on. But one piece of this is to say that those countries that stay with stronger family support systems, as in East Asia, for example, they have exactly the same kinds of, I don't know if you call them fiscal problems, budgetary problems, pressures from population aging, as do the public systems. They also have mammoth implicit debt in just the same way. You have obligations to the old people, familial obligations. They may not be contractual exactly. And part of moving to any sort of other support system is somehow dealing with those familial obligations. If you move to a public system, then in some way those familial obligations may be reformulated into public transfer obligations, but they remain, and there's a different sort of responsibility bond or recognition bond for the switch in transfer systems, or even more so, of course, to a funded system. Well, I'm only going to say a very short word about the demographic side of this, but I think because of the continuing close contact with Europe, Latin America has had, or parts of Latin America have had rather different demographic transitions than is typical for developing countries. Most developing countries began a many began a mortality transition around 1900, but the fertility transition typically began in the 1960s or later. But in parts of Latin America, fertility transition began more or less when it happened in Europe in the late 19th century or early 20th century. And then it proceeded for a while, and then it stalled in mid-century, and now it has begun, not now, but recently it has begun again. So that gives a distinctive pattern of aging and so on to, and creates a lot of diversity within Latin America. So if we look at, Argentina, Uruguay, Cuba, Chile are all early starters in the transition. So on average in the Latin American Caribbean region, from general usual data sources, fertility is just at replacement now in 2015. South America a bit below replacement at 2.0, Central America 2.4, Caribbean 2.3. These countries that are currently below replacement level in Latin America generally have total fertility rates in the range of 1.7 to 1.9 births per woman. Not dramatically low, but low, and presumably still falling in some of these countries. I expect Mexico will be joining this list pretty soon, and I expect Brazil is going to keep dropping and so on. We'll see what happens. Okay, so that's just a word about the demographic transition, and of course this means that population aging is in the futures of all these countries, really. Now, I think some of the same forces, that is the continuing contact with Europe and European culture and policies and so on, has also affected the transfer transition in Latin America, in the sense that Latin America, I think, has been an early adopter of public pensions, much more fully developed than in other parts of the world, certainly than in Asia or in Africa. Asia, even with higher incomes, has continued to rely more heavily on the family support system, but in Latin America we have this blossoming of different forms of public pensions. And I think these substitute with family support for the elderly. I'll show some cross-country over time data on that in a moment. In countries that have somewhat generous public pension systems, then the traditional direction of net transfers to the elderly from the family reverses. And you have, I think, perhaps the more generous the public pension system, the bigger the transfers from the elderly on net to their families, on average, for people above 65. Now that's on net. If you look at gross flows, there are going to be families who are continuing to support their elderly, particularly when they're 75 or 80 or 85 or in poor economic condition. And they're also elderly supporting the family. But on average, it seems that the flows have largely reversed. And again, that's a contrast with East Asia, for example. And then there is this matter which I don't think it was called elder bias, but it often is called elder bias. This is a difference from Europe and perhaps not so different than East Asia. Well, very different than East Asia in some way, not so different in a low level of public transfers to children, because public investment in education in East Asia is also, I would say, moderately low, but there it's supplemented by a very high level of private investment in human capital. In Latin America, well, we'll look at that in a moment. Maybe it's even the next slide. Yeah. So this is with National Transfer Account data. We have calculated a synthetic cohort measure of investment per child, which is the sum of public spending per child at age 0, at age 1, at age 2. We do that sum up to, let's say, 20, or for education, 26, to capture higher education. And that's a measure of investment per child in human capital. That's on this axis. And then on this axis, we do the same thing for public transfers to the elderly. We add transfers to a 65-year-old, a 66-year-old, a 67-year-old, all the way up, weighted by survival. And what we see here is, let's see, the red dots are Latin American countries. The blue are European and the United States. And East Asia are these X's here, and Southeast Asia down here. And these dotted lines are the medians, median spending on children, median spending on the elderly. And I should say that here, as elsewhere in what I'm going to show you, we sort of standardize by dividing by average labor income, ages 30 to 49, for each country. That way we can make them comparable. It's a little bit like expressing things relative to per capita income or something like that. So that's why we can put all these on the same graph. So what you see is that the Latin American countries are this button. The Latin American countries are largely in the bottom right quadrant of that diagram, with lower than median investment in children and higher than median investment in the elderly. The usual pattern, the broad pattern in this picture, is that countries either invest heavily in children and in old age income security, or they invest little in both. But Latin America is different in investing generously, not investing, spending generously for the elderly, and not so generously for children. And you see, so the upper right is an example of Europe, US, Japan here, where there's high spending in both categories. And then here in Asia, you tend to have low spending in both categories because the family is much more important than in other parts of the world in terms of both investing in children and in the elderly. And then there's some out here that are investing more heavily in children, less heavily in the elderly. Okay, so that's the national transfer account diagram. I just was looking at another diagram from a different study using a very different methodology, but shows basically the same thing. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, but who knows? There may be some way these data are misleading that you'll tell me about. Okay, now what have I done here? Yeah, going the wrong direction. Thank you. Okay, so I want to look at transfers in Latin America using NTA data. So we're going to look at labor income by age. I have to explain what that is in NTA. We're looking at before tax wages, salaries, fringe benefits provided by employers, including things like payroll tax, shares, and so on. And then for self-employment income, unpaid family labor, mixed income, we count 2/3 of that as, stop it. We count 2/3 of that as labor income, and 1/3 is asset income accruing to the owner of the farm or the small enterprise. And then consumption includes private expenditures, which we impute to individuals within each household in various ways I won't explain now. And it includes public in-kind transfers, mainly education and healthcare. Is that a 0? 10. Okay. Glad to hear it. Okay, and public in-kind transfers, because to receive education is to consume it, to receive health care is to consume it, but of course it doesn't include pensions, because you receive a pension, you can save it, you can give the money to someone else or whatever. And then later we'll be looking at asset income. The concept of asset income in NTA is broad. It includes interest, dividends, but it also, if you own a house and live in the house, you're enjoying the services of a capital good, the house, and so that is counted as asset income. And we also have the share of self-employment mixed income. The 1/3 share is also asset income and things of that sort. And we average these across all individuals at a given age, males and females, zeros for people with no labor income and positive numbers for others. So it's a population average of labor income at each age or consumption at each age. And then we express it as a ratio to average labor income to make it comparable across countries. Okay, and this is the average of 9 Latin American countries. I won't list them all unless you would like me to. But the shape is sort of typical. The blue, of course, is consumption, and the red is labor income. You can see that labor income continues to be robust at older ages. That would be quite different than if we looked at a European country or China or Taiwan, where they have very low income at older ages. And you can see that it starts picking up in the mid-teens. Then, if you recall Salvador's point yesterday afternoon, it's, I think, striking that the elderly, on average, are consuming about the same or perhaps a little bit more than younger adults. And that is typical around the world. There's some exceptions. For example, Korea. In Korea, the elderly consume rather less, and they acknowledge a big problem with elder poverty and so on. But the typical pattern is more like this. And I should say in the US and Sweden and Germany and Japan, if I had more time, I would show it looks more like that. And that, I believe, is driven by public transfers. A big chunk of it is healthcare, but I think it's also increased consumption by the elderly funded out of public pension systems. It's one of the interesting findings in this project. Now, I'm showing this because I want to talk about how this gap is filled. This is what public pensions are for, and that's part of what makes up this gap. But this gap is also made up by net private transfers, differing from country to country, age, and so on. And it's made up by asset income, or the portion of asset income that is consumed, that is asset income minus savings. And so I'm now going to show some data on how that gap is made up in different countries above age 65. And age 65 is arbitrary. If you look at the cross point here, well, it looks like it's maybe 55 or 56, 57. But we'll use 65, even though that's missing some of this. For other purposes, we could, of course, integrate over the whole thing or whatever. Okay. Now, this is a slide from, work by Louis Rosero Bixby, Liliana Roldan, and Francisco Carabaja. And trying to remember, I think this is from maybe a United Nations report. It's in a reference list at the end of these slides. And so what we see here, I'm not sure whether you can distinguish the colors on those bars or not. But so this is for over 65. This is less than 20 years. I won't talk about that now. But over 65, we have the blue is family contributions. The red is public transfers, which would include health care. And the green is asset income minus savings. And so this is Taiwan, and it's roughly a third, a third, a third. That's a balanced three-legged stool, you might say. If we go on, here's the U.S. Can you see these colors on the bars? Sort of. Okay. We'll have a better look at this in a different way in a moment. But the green is assets, and asset income is used very heavily in the U.S. About 2/3 of this gap between labor consumption and labor income is filled by consumption of asset income.
So it's not just asset income, it's also asset
Funded pensions.
Eating away the asset. It's also included.
Not necessarily. Well, I mean, this is asset income minus savings. Typically, savings are positive, so the assets are still growing, but some of the asset income is consumed. In the United States, this is quite atypical. We'll see again in a moment. I should have said, now asset income would include, for example, in the United States, that's going to include 401ks, IRAs, funded pension things. If it were a government-run funded pension program, that part of it that is paid for out of asset income would be counted as asset income in this plot. This is including public and private sectors. Well, yeah. Okay, so that's the U.S. Chile, here in, I think this is 1997. Sorry, that's a little bit old. Big role for public transfers. This would be unfunded public transfers. This part is asset income. That's probably reflecting the asset part of the retirement program. And then in Chile, families are actually receiving net transfers as they are in the USA. The elderly are helping their children and grandchildren. Here we have Brazil. You see this huge role of public transfers, a smaller role for asset income, and then I think the biggest transfers from elderly to family in any of the NTA countries we studied. And well, I'll go to the next diagram because it has the same information, but that will sort of give you a grounding for understanding this triangle diagram, which is showing the same thing. Old age support systems showing the proportion of consumption minus labor income after age 65 that is paid by out of asset income up here, family transfers here, and public transfers here. If you're at any of those corners, you're 100%, the elderly are 100% funded out of that source. If you're along this edge, it shows the division between asset income and public transfers, and so on. Here we have Taiwan close to the middle, close to a third on each. So family transfers are here. If you're outside the triangle on this side, it means you're not receiving support from family. You're yourself helping to support other family members. So that's the setup. Now, what do we see here? Well, down around this corner, we have countries at 100% reliance on public transfers. Hungary, Austria, Sweden, Ecuador in 2011 is more than 100% funded. And Brazil here, it's a little hard to read, but you have to imagine a line drawn parallel here, and it also is more than 100% consumption funded out of public transfers. And then all those within this circle are at least 2/3 funding old age consumption out of public transfers. And as I said, if you look along this line, you're seeing division between asset income and public transfers. So a lot of Latin American countries are in this oval. We have Chile, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Brazil, and for Ecuador and Chile we have 2 years, so they're double counted. Uruguay is a little less important. And then Mexico is very different, much more heavily reliant on asset income. Okay, and now here are Asian countries with stronger family support systems, Korea, Taiwan, China. In East Asia, here we have Thailand in Southeast Asia. I've already said this is a, whoopsie, this is a very typical kind of situation in which countries with strong pension programs are actually not receiving family transfers, but making net transfers to younger people. And then up here, we have countries in which the elderly are strongly reliant on asset income. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is skip over this section on transfer load. Let me just say what I would show there is that just as population aging causes problems for the public transfer system, it causes problems for the private transfer system. In Latin America, because there's so many transfers for young to old, from old to young in the private transfer system, population aging is actually sort of relaxing the private transfer benefit. You have more older people to make transfers to fewer kids. And the reverse is happening in the public sector. Because I'm skipping that because I want to go on to 3 last things. How old is too old? Is fertility too low in Latin America? So the project had an article published in Science in the fall of 2014. We had 50 authors, and we do what Professor Barr was advising us of the pitfalls of. That is, this is a comparative steady state analysis because it's the relationship of fertility to population aging emerges in the long run. And we want to say, how do levels of fertility affect support ratios, affect dependency loads, and so on in the long term? If you have a very high fertility rate, you have a lot of children and few elderly, and you have high child dependency costs. If you have very low fertility, you have a lot of elderly, you have high elderly costs and low child costs. In between, there is a level that will, in some sense, be maximizing something. Usually that something isn't of great interest. It's something like helping the government be comfortable. Now, how does this turn out? Well, in Latin America, if you just thought of it from the perspective of the public sector, you would want very high fertility compared to other regions because of this elder bias. If you think of it more broadly than the public sector, you want fertility pretty close to what there already is in Latin America. If you include the fact that there are capital costs to population growth, and with higher fertility you have to build more factories and build more houses and more roads and so on, and you still take into account all these other things as well, you end up thinking that fertility, say somewhere between 1.5 and 2, is probably a good thing. And so the bottom line from that line of argument is no, Latin America does not have fertility that is too low, nor does most of the rest of the world, except maybe countries with total fertility rates below 1.5 or so. And the outcome surface is pretty flat. It isn't like there's any real penalty from wandering from that range I just mentioned. Okay, I've probably hit 0. What do you think? Can I? Okay, I'll just try to whet your appetite a little. This is NTA by socioeconomic status, by quartiles of the education distribution. This is in Costa Rica. So you see the bottom quartile and the top quartile. Bottom quartile, people barely ever pay for their consumption. And then this is the same thing for Ecuador. And we can do the whole, this is Colombia. We have public transfers. I'll just point out that there is this article by Tovar and Ordinola on Colombia. There's a lot of detail there. And this is on Chile and Brazil. This is from a social panorama of Latin American ECLAC publication, but the chapter was actually prepared by Tasio Tura and the NTA project. These are net public transfers received. So that's a glimpse of doing national transfer accounts by socioeconomic status, and they'll give you a glimpse on the mortality side, and that will be it. No concluding slide. So this is work by Luis Rosero Bixby, again with Will Dow. This is the mortality gradient by socioeconomic status in the U.S. This is the gradient in Costa Rica, and this is ages 40 to 64. Here we're looking at older ages, the gradient in the U.S., the gradient in Costa Rica. There's very little gradient in Costa Rica, and if I don't have time to go over that, but in Costa Rica it appears the gradient has steepened a bit, and you can see the gradient in health-related behaviors, in obesity, in smoking and drinking and so on, lying behind the fact that richer people have many bad health behaviors and that accounts for this flatter mortality SES relationship in Costa Rica. This also looks at Mexico. I don't have time to discuss that. This is looking at Chile, and you also see a steepening of the mortality gradient. This is not life expectancy, but mortality. You see a steepening between the early 90s and the early 2000s. And in fact, you see an increase in mortality at the lowest education group and a decrease at the highest group. But it's difficult to separate out the effects of selectivity that I discussed earlier. Anyway, that's what you see for males and females in Chile. Brazil, mortality is 2 to 5 times higher among women with no schooling compared to women with 9+. That's Casiotura and Elisenda Renteria. And then last slide, this is Brazil. This is from work by Pereira, Freire, and Quiros. This paper isn't even written yet. Some of the other things I've shown are in process. I got permission from the authors to show. I just want to convey that this is a sort of research frontier, and this is stuff that's just happening. Well, this is quite striking, I think. This is life expectancy at birth, and the socioeconomic measure here is per capita household income, and you see differences of, say, 6 to 12 years between the top quintile, I think it's the top quintile and the bottom quintile in each region of Brazil, and for men and for women. And in the Northeast, the difference rose to 12 years for women. So the point is, there is the material here to do something. If anyone, of course, this is interesting in itself, I think, and very sad and worrisome in itself, but you can also do the kind of thing that we did for the U.S. So thank you very much, and sorry to talk so long.